The Valori Dominion had watched Earth for 50 years from the dark edges of the solar system, and in all that time, they had seen nothing that impressed them even a little bit. Their scout ships drifted past Neptune and Saturn, recording everything the humans did with their primitive rockets and clumsy space stations. And every report that went back to the Dominion High Command said the same thing over and over again. These creatures were weak and soft and posed no threat to anyone. High Commander Zethral stood on the bridge of his massive flagship, the Eternal Conquest, reading the latest intelligence summary on his holographic display, while his officers waited in respectful silence behind him. The ship stretched for 3 kilometers and carried enough firepower to crack a planet in half. And Zethral had used that power many times before against species far more advanced than these humans. They have only just learned to travel beyond their single moon, Zethral thought, pausing deliberately as he processed this final piece of intelligence. He said to his war council, his forearms folded across his scaled chest in a gesture of contempt. And their weapons are nothing more than chemical explosives and kinetic projectiles that our shields will brush aside like dust. The council members clicked their approval in the Valori way, their iridescent scales shimmering under the bridge lights as they imagined another easy conquest to add to their empire. The Dominion had crushed over 200 species across 3 galaxies in its long history, and not one of those species had managed to resist for more than a few rotations of their home world. Humans would be no different. The diplomatic vessel arrived at Earth on a Tuesday morning, descending through the atmosphere with a grace that made every human aircraft look like a child's toy. Ambassador Kira Voss watched it land from the window of the coalition headquarters in Geneva, her coffee growing cold in her hands as she studied the alien ship's smooth curves and pulsing energy fields. She was 54 years old, with gray streaks in her dark hair, and a calm face that revealed nothing of what she felt inside. 20 years ago, she had commanded a destroyer in the Pacific during the worst naval battles of the decade, and she had learned back then how to keep her fear locked away where no one can see it. The Valori delegate emerged from the ship surrounded by armed guards who stood 8 feet tall and carried weapons that hummed with deadly energy. Kira met them in the main conference hall, with generals and politicians flanking her on both sides, all of them trying very hard not to show how afraid they truly were. The delegate was called Vornash, and he looked down at the humans with eyes that held no respect and no curiosity, only the bored superiority of someone who had done this many times before. "I bring a message from the Valori Dominion," Vornash announced through a translation device that made his rumbling voice sound almost human, "and you will listen carefully, because I will not repeat myself." He explained what the Dominion wanted in simple terms that left no room for confusion or hope. Earth would surrender immediately and completely, and all humans would become servants of the Dominion, working in mines and factories to fuel the Empire's endless expansion. Those who cooperated would be allowed to live in relative comfort, and those who resisted would be destroyed, along with their families and their cities, and everything they had ever built. Kira listened without expression, her hands folded on the table in front of her, while translators processed every word and diplomats scribbled frantic notes. When Vornash finished speaking, she asked a simple question in a voice as calm as still water. "And if we refuse?" The Valori delegate made a sound that might have been laughter, though it came out more like rocks grinding together. "Metal drum." "No species refuses," he said as if explaining something obvious to a small child, "because refusal means extinction, and all creatures wish to survive above everything else." Kira nodded slowly and asked for 72 hours to consult with world leaders and prepare a formal response. Vornash agreed without hesitation, because he had seen this pattern hundreds of times before, the desperate request for time that always ended with surrender and submission. He returned to his ship, certain that the humans would capitulate just like every other species had done throughout history. What Vornosh did not understand, what no Valori could possibly understand, was that humanity had spent its entire existence fighting and killing and surviving against impossible odds. Every generation of humans had produced warriors who learned to face death without flinching. Every nation on Earth had veterans who had seen horrors that would shatter the minds, lesser beings, and scattered across the planet in quiet retirement homes and suburban houses and tiny apartments were millions of men and women who had once been soldiers, who had fought in jungles and deserts and frozen mountains, who had killed enemies and watched friends die and somehow kept going anyway. The message went out through channels that governments had officially shut down decades ago, encrypted frequencies that only veterans knew how to access. It was simple and short and needed no explanation. Report for duty. In a small town in Texas, a 67-year-old man named Carl Bishop read the message on an old military communicator he had kept hidden in his garage for 30 years. He had been a sergeant in the infantry during the Mexican Border War, and he still remembered every face of every soldier he had lost in those bloody months of fighting. His wife found him in the garage an hour later, cleaning a rifle that she had never seen before with hands that moved with practiced ease. "You're going," she said, and it was not a question. Carl looked at her with eyes that had gone hard in a way she had not seen since he came home from the war all those years ago. "They need people who know how to fight," he said quietly, "and I still remember how." Across the world, the same scene played out in different languages and different homes. Former soldiers who had become teachers and farmers and accountants received the call and answered without hesitation. In Japan, a 70-year-old woman named Yuki Tanaka, who had served as a sniper in the Asian conflicts, dusted off her rifle and reported to the nearest military base. In Germany, a retired tank commander named Hans Müller gathered his old crew through phone calls that lasted only seconds. In Brazil and Nigeria and Australia and dozens of other countries, veterans emerged from civilian life like wolves shedding sheeps. The young soldiers, who still served in active militaries, watched these old warriors arrive at bases and training facilities with a mixture of confusion and awe. These gray-haired men and women moved differently than civilians, spoke differently, carried themselves with a quiet confidence that came only from having faced death and survived. General Marcus Cole, the commander of Earth's combined military forces, stood before a holographic display showing the Valori fleet positioned beyond Mars. He was 58 years old and had fought in 3 major conflicts during his career, but he had never faced anything like this. "We are outgunned and outmatched," he said to his assembled officers, his voice steady despite the fear that churned in his gut. "And by every logical measure, we should surrender and hope for mercy." He paused and looked around the room at the faces of men and women who had chosen to fight rather than submit. "Not going to surrender," he continued with a thin smile, "because surrender is not something humans do very well, and these aliens are about to learn that lesson the hard way." The 72 hours passed, with the world holding its breath. Ambassador Kira Voss transmitted humanity's response on every frequency the coalition could reach. A single word repeated in every human language that had ever existed: no. And somewhere beyond Mars, High Commander Zethral received that message and felt something he had not experienced in over a century of conquest. Admiral Patricia Hayes had not worn a uniform in 7 years, but it still fit her body like a second skin when she pulled it from the back of her closet. She was 63 years old, with silver hair cut short, and eyes that had seen too much death to ever look truly peaceful again. During her career, she had commanded fleets in the South China Sea crisis and led the naval assault during the Arctic War, and she had buried more sailors than she could count in conflicts that history books were already beginning to forget. Now she stood in the Coalition's Emergency Command Center, a massive bunker carved deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, staring at holographic displays that showed the Valori Armada moving closer to Earth with every passing hour. "Give me the numbers," she said to her assembled staff, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had given orders under fire more times than she could remember. Colonel Daniel Price stepped forward with a monologue down, tablet in his cybernetic hand, the metal fingers clicking softly against the screen as he pulled up the tactical data. He was 49 years old and had lost his left arm to an explosion during the Indonesian campaign, replacing it with military-grade hardware that was stronger and faster than flesh had ever been. 12,000 Valori warships confirmed, he reported in a flat tone that betrayed no emotion. Each one carrying weapons that can punch through anything we have, and shields that our best missiles cannot scratch. Patricia nodded slowly, and asked the question that everyone in the room was afraid to hear answered. "And what do we have?" 400 combat-capable vessels, and another 300 that we are pulling from mothballs and museums, as fast as we can make them spaceworthy. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bones. The mathematics of the situation were simple and brutal, and left no room for hope. We're outnumbered 30-1 against an enemy with superior technology and centuries of combat experience. Patricia allowed herself a small smile that confused everyone watching her. "I did not ask about our ships, Daniel," she said quietly. "I asked about our forces." The global call to arms had been answered beyond anything the Coalition had dared to hope for. Veterans from every nation and every conflict of the past 50 years emerged from retirement and reported for duty at bases around the world. Men and women in their 60s and 70s stood in formation alongside their children and grandchildren who had served in more recent wars. Drill sergeants who had not shouted at recruits in decades found their voices again, and soldiers who had not held weapons since their discharge discovered that their hands still remembered exactly what to do. Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos arrived at Pearl Harbor on a transport plane filled with other naval veterans who had answered the call. She was 51 years old, with streaks of gray in her black hair and calluses on her hands from the fishing boat she had operated for the past decade. During the Indonesian campaign, she had commanded a submarine that sank 17 enemy vessels in 3 months of brutal underwater warfare. And the memories of those kills still visited her dreams on nights when sleep came hard. The base was organized chaos when she stepped off the plane. Thousands of people moving with urgent purpose as equipment was loaded and ships were prepared for launch. A young ensign with wide eyes and a fresh uniform approached her with obvious nervousness. "Chief Santos," he said, with a salute that was almost correct, "I have been assigned to escort you to your new posting." Maria returned the salute and followed the young man through crowds of workers and soldiers, watching the activity with eyes that missed nothing. "You look scared," she observed without judgment as they walked. The ensign swallowed hard and nodded, seeing no point in lying to someone who had clearly seen through him instantly. "We are outgunned by a factor of 30, he said quietly, "and their technology makes ours look like toys from a museum exhibit." Maria stopped walking and turned to face the young man directly. "Let me tell you something that took me 20 years to understand," she said in a voice that was almost gentle. "Being outgunned does not mean being outfought, and humans have been winning impossible battles since before we learned to write things down." She started walking again, without waiting to see if her words had any effect. Around the world, the same transformation was happening in factories, research facilities, and military installations. Engineers who had spent years designing consumer electronics now worked around the clock on weapons systems. Scientists abandoned their research projects to focus on a single goal: finding any weakness in Valori technology that could be exploited. The alien shields seemed impenetrable, But human history was filled with walls that had seemed impenetrable, right up until someone figured out how to knock them down. Dr. Samuel Gray was 71 years old and had been retired from weapons research for almost 15 years when the call came. He arrived at a secret facility in Nevada with notebooks full of theoretical designs that had been rejected as too dangerous during peacetime. These weapons would be banned under every international treaty ever written, he told the gathered military officials, with something that might have been shame or might have been pride, because they are designed to cause maximum destruction with no regard for rules or honor. General Marcus Cole looked at the old scientist with understanding in his eyes. "Dr. Gray," he said firmly, "we are fighting for the survival of our entire species against an enemy that wants to enslave or exterminate every human being on this planet." He paused and let those words sink in before continuing. "Build whatever you need to build." The training facilities ran 24 hours a day as veterans taught younger soldiers the hard lessons they had learned in conflicts around the globe. A former Special Forces operator named Jake Morrison, who was 57 years old and walked with a limp from an injury that had ended his active career, demonstrated close-quarters combat techniques to a group of Marines who could have been his grandchildren. "The Valori are bigger and stronger than us," he said, while throwing a soldier twice his size to the mat with casual ease. "But that doesn't matter if you know where to hit them and when to hit them and how to disappear before they can hit back. The old ways of war, the guerrilla tactics and ambush strategies and dirty tricks that humans had used against each other for thousands of years, were dusted off and adapted for a new enemy." Patricia Hayes worked 18-hour days in her command bunker, building a strategy that went against everything the Valori expected. "They think we will stand and fight like honorable warriors," she explained to her staff during one of countless planning sessions, "because that is what every other species has done when faced with the Dominion." She pulled up historical records on her display, showing battles from human history that had been won through cunning rather than strength. "We are not going to do that," she continued with a cold smile. "We are going to fight like humans, which means we are going to cheat and lie and stab them in the back every chance we get." The 72-hour deadline came and went, and humanity's refusal echoed across the solar system. High Commander Zethral received the response aboard the Eternal Conquest and felt his confusion turn slowly to anger. No species had ever refused the Dominion's offer before. No species had ever been foolish enough to choose extinction over submission. He gave the order to begin the invasion with a wave of one scaled hand, certain that the humans would learn their place soon enough. The Valori fleet began to move toward Earth, thousands of warships carrying millions of soldiers who expected an easy victory. And in bunkers and bases and hidden facilities around the planet, humanity prepared to teach them just how wrong they were. The first Valori warships entered Earth orbit on a cold morning in December, their massive hulls blocking out the sun as they descended through the atmosphere like metal gods coming to claim their due. High Commander Zethral watched from the bridge of the Eternal Conquest as his advance fleet engaged the pathetic human vessels that rose to meet them, expecting the battle to be over within hours. He was wrong about that, and he was wrong about many other things as well. Captain Benjamin Morton stood on the bridge of the TCS Defiant, an old destroyer that should have been scrapped 10 years ago, but had been pulled from a museum and made spaceworthy in just 3 weeks. His crew was a strange mix of active-duty sailors and veterans who had been civilians a month before, and their average age was 47 years. His weapons officer was a grandmother named Linda Chen, who had served on missile cruisers during the Pacific conflicts. His navigator was a retired merchant marine captain named Oscar Ruiz, who had not worn a uniform since his children were born. They were old and tired, and facing an enemy with technology that made their weapons look like toys, and not one of them was afraid. "Their shields are deflecting our main guns," Linda reported, as energy blasts splashed harmlessly against the lead Valori cruiser. "We cannot punch through with anything we have." Benjamin studied the tactical display with eyes that had tracked enemy vessels through 3 different wars, looking for something the Valori might not expect. "Then we do not punch through," he said calmly, while enemy fire rocked the ship around him. "We find another way to hurt them." He ordered his ships to target the external equipment on the Valori vessels, the sensor arrays and communication dishes, and anything else that existed outside their protective shields. It was not a killing blow, but it was damage, and damage added up over time. The Defiant and her sister ships began a fighting retreat that confused the Valori commanders, who had never seen anything like it. Instead of standing in formation and dying with honor as every other species had done, the human vessels scattered and regrouped and struck from unexpected angles. They used asteroids for cover and fired missiles from hiding places and vanished into the darkness between planets, only to reappear somewhere else entirely. It was chaotic and messy and completely without dignity. It was also effective. Commander Voreth led the ground invasion force that landed outside Denver, his troops marching through the empty streets with weapons ready and expectations of easy conquest. The humans had fled before them, abandoning their homes and businesses in what looked like panic. Voreth smiled at the sight, his scales rippling with satisfaction as he imagined the commendations he would receive for such a swift victory. Then the first explosion tore through his formation, killing 30 soldiers in a blast of fire and shrapnel that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Sergeant Laura Kim watched from a rooftop 3 blocks away as the Valori scrambled for cover, her old rifle steady in hands that had not fired a weapon in 15 years. She was 51 years old and had served in the Mountain Division during the Alaskan conflict, learning to fight in frozen wilderness against enemies who knew the terrain better than she did. Now she was using those same skills against invaders who had no idea what they were walking into. Her squad consisted of 12 veterans who had been civilians just weeks ago, gathered through a text chain that had not been used since their unit disbanded. Pete Walsh crouched beside her, a former corporal who now ran a hardware store and had brought half his inventory along in the form of materials that could be turned into. "They are advancing down Main Street," he whispered, while checking the detonator in his hand, "right into the kill zone." Laura nodded and raised her rifle, sighting on a Valori officer whose fancy armor made him an easy target. "They think we're innocent," she said quietly as her finger tightened on the trigger. "Let us show them how wrong they are." The shot took the officer through a gap in his armor where the neck met the shoulder, and he dropped without a sound. Then Pete triggered the explosives they had buried under the street, and the Valori advance turned into chaos. Across the planet, the same story played out in different cities and different languages. The Valori landed their troops expecting frightened civilians who would surrender at the first show of force. Instead, they found booby traps and snipers, and enemies who melted into buildings and sewers and subway tunnels, only to emerge behind them with knives. Hatred. In Tokyo, an 80-year-old grandmother named Yuki Tanaka killed 7 Valori soldiers from a hospital rooftop before disappearing into the city's underground maze. In Cairo, a group of veterans who had fought on opposite sides of conflicts just 10 years ago worked together to ambush a Valori patrol, their old grudges forgotten in the face of a common enemy. In Moscow, a retired general named Alexei Volkov organized resistance cells using tactics his grandfather had used against Nazi invaders almost a century before. Commander Voreth contacted his superiors from a fortified position in what had once been a shopping mall, his voice carrying confusion and something that might have been fear. "The civilians are fighting," he reported while gunfire echoed in the distance. "Not just their soldiers, but everyone, old and young, men and women, they are all fighting." High Commander Zethral dismissed the report as exaggeration. Civilians did not fight against trained warriors. Civilians ran and hid and begged for mercy. That was how conquest worked, and it had always worked that way for as long as the Dominion had existed. But the reports kept coming from every continent and every landing zone, each one telling the same impossible story. Human civilians were not running. They were not hiding. They were killing Valori soldiers with weapons they had made in their garages, and bombs they had assembled from household chemicals and tactics they had learned in wars that the aliens knew nothing about. In orbit, the battle continued with the same frustrating pattern. The human ships refused to form battle lines or engage in honorable combat. They darted and weaved and struck from ambush, using every dirty trick their crews could imagine. Captain Benjamin Morton lost 2 ships from his small fleet, watching their icons vanish from his display as Valori weapons finally caught. But his surviving vessels had crippled 8 enemy cruisers and destroyed 24 support ships, a ratio that should have been impossible. Admiral Patricia Hayes watched the battle unfold from her command center and allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. "They expected us to fight like the other species they conquered," she said to Colonel Daniel Price, who stood beside her, standing in neat formations and dying with dignity. She pulled up a map, showing the chaos spreading across Earth as human resistance fighters made every inch of ground cost the Valori dearly. "But we are not dignified," she continued with a cold smile. "We are survivors, and survivors fight dirty." The first week of the invasion ended with the Valori controlling nothing except the ground directly beneath their feet. Every base they established was attacked within hours. Every patrol they sent out was ambushed. Every moment of peace they tried to claim was shattered by humans who refused to accept defeat. High Commander Zethral stood on his bridge, looking at casualty reports that made no sense to him. He had lost more soldiers in 7 days on Earth than he had lost in the previous 50 years of conquest combined, and the humans showed no signs of slowing down. 3 months into the invasion, the Valori Dominion controlled exactly nothing on Earth. They had landed on every continent and destroyed dozens of cities and killed millions of human beings. But they held no territory and enforced no rule, and found no moment of peace anywhere on the planet. High Commander Zethral stood before a holographic map in his war room, staring at red markers that represented resistance activity. The entire globe was covered in red. "This is impossible," he said to his officers, who stood in uncomfortable silence around him. "No species resists like this. No species fights when they have already lost." His chief advisor, a veteran strategist named Kethros, who had served the Dominion for over a century, studied the map with troubled eyes. "The humans have not lost," he said carefully. "They have simply refused to acknowledge that they should have." It was a distinction that made no sense to Valori thinking, but it was the only explanation that fit the evidence. The humans kept fighting because they did not believe they were beaten, and nothing the Dominion did seemed capable of changing their minds. Admiral Patricia Hayes had relocated her command to a converted mining station on the far side of the moon, hidden from Valori sensors by the bulk of Earth's only natural satellite. From there, she coordinated a guerrilla campaign that spanned the entire solar system, using every ship and every soldier and every dirty trick that humanity could muster. Her fleet had grown in strange ways over the past 3 months. Military vessels fought alongside converted cargo ships and mining platforms and anything else that could carry a weapon and a crew willing to use it. Lieutenant Commander Kyle Reese led a squadron of these improvised warships against a Valori supply convoy near the asteroid belt. His vessels held together by hope and welding tape and the stubborn refusal to accept reality. He was 44 years old and had been a submarine warfare specialist before the invasion, teaching tactics at a community college to students who had never expected to need them. Now he commanded a flagship that had been a cargo hauler 2 months ago, crewed by people who had been accountants and nurses and teachers and everything except soldiers. Enemy convoy detected, his sensor officer reported, a young woman named Rachel Torres, who had been studying for her engineering degree when the world ended. 12 transport ships with a destroyer escort. Kyle studied the tactical display and saw exactly what he expected. Valori ships flying in perfect formation, with shields at full strength and weapons ready for any attack. They were prepared for everything except what he was about to do. All ships, he said into his communicator, execute attack pattern Crazy Ivan. The name came from an old submarine maneuver that no sane captain would attempt because it was too dangerous and too unpredictable. His squadrons scattered in 12 different directions, each ship following a random course that made no tactical sense whatsoever. The Valori escort tried to track them and failed, their targeting computers unable to predict movements that had no logic behind them. Then Kyle's ships regrouped behind an asteroid and fired everything they had into the convoy's unprotected rear. 11 transport ships died in the first volley, their cargo of supplies and reinforcements scattered across the void in clouds of debris and frozen bodies. The destroyer turned to engage, but Kyle was already gone, his ships vanishing into the asteroid field where the larger Valori vessel could not follow. "Barbaric," the Valori commander transmitted on an open channel. "You fight without honor or dignity." Kyle smiled and keyed his own transmitter. "We fight to win," he replied simply. And right now we are winning. On Earth, the ground war had settled into a brutal stalemate that bled the Valori dry, one soldier at a time. Maria Santos had been given command of an old submarine that engineers had somehow made spaceworthy, and she used it to hunt Valori vessels in the oceans that covered most of the planet's surface. The aliens had never encountered underwater warfare before, and they had no idea how to counter an enemy that could hide beneath kilometers of water and strike without warning. She surfaced near a small island in the Pacific to take on supplies from a coalition support ship, her crew exhausted but unbroken after weeks of constant operations. A young officer named Rachel Torres, who had transferred from Kyle's squadron to gain experience in different combat environments, stood beside her on the deck. "You have changed since this started," Maria observed, while watching her crew load missiles designed from reverse-engineered Valori technology. "You move differently and speak differently." Rachel stared at the horizon where smoke still rose from a Valori base they had destroyed the previous night. "I understand now," she said quietly, "what you and the other veterans went through, what war does to people who survive it." Maria nodded slowly and decided the young woman deserved honesty. "War does not make heroes," she said. "It makes survivors. And survivors do whatever they must to keep surviving, even when the cost is higher than they ever imagined." The resistance on Earth had organized itself in ways that surprised even the veterans who had started it. Cells in different countries shared intelligence through networks that the Valori could not detect or disrupt. Former enemies who had fought against each other in human conflicts now worked together against a common threat. A Russian colonel named Natasha Volkov coordinated operations with American Special Forces. Officers who had once been her targets, and Israeli commandos shared tactics with fighters from nations that did not officially recognize his country's existence. Old hatreds were set aside because they simply did not matter anymore. High Commander Zethral demanded explanations from his intelligence division during a council meeting that had become a daily ritual of bad news and confusion. "Why do they not fragment?" he asked with frustration that bordered on desperation. Every psychological model predicted that they would turn on each other under pressure. Kethros pulled up analysis that he had been working on for weeks, trying to understand an enemy that defied everything the Dominion knew about conquered species. The humans have a pattern we did not anticipate, he explained carefully. They fight among themselves constantly, generation after generation, war after war, without end. He paused to let that sink in before continuing. Faced with an external threat, they stop fighting each other and unite against the common enemy. It is as if warfare is their natural state, and peace is the temporary condition between conflicts. Zethral stared at his advisor, with something that might have been horror. You are saying they are always at war? I am saying they have never not been at war, Commander, not in their entire history as a species. The implications of that statement hung in the air like poison. The Dominion had conquered species that were peaceful, and species that were warlike, and species that fell everywhere in between. But they had never encountered a species that existed in a permanent state of conflict, that produced warriors as naturally as breathing, that treated survival as the only goal worth pursuing, regardless of cost. The humans were not fighting because they thought they could win. They were fighting because fighting was what they did. Patricia Hayes reviewed the casualty reports in her command center and felt the weight of every name on the lists that grew longer each day. They were losing people faster than they could replace them, and the Valori still outnumbered them by a factor of 20, even after 3 months of constant attrition. But the Valori were losing too, and their losses hurt them in ways that human losses did not. Every Valori soldier who died on Earth was irreplaceable, drawn from a population that had grown soft after centuries of easy conquest. Every human who fell was mourned and then replaced by another who was just as determined to fight. It was not a sustainable strategy for either side, but humans had proven throughout their history that they could sustain the unsustainable longer than anyone believed possible. Patricia looked at her staff, exhausted men and women who had been working without rest for months, and made a decision. We cannot win this war through attrition, she announced. So we are going to change the rules. She pulled up plans that she had been developing in secret, a strategy so audacious that it made her own officers gasp. We are going to take the fight to them. The war lasted 4 years, and in the end, it was not a single battle that broke the Valori Dominion's will to fight. It was the accumulation of losses that never stopped, the constant bleeding that drained their strength day after day, the slow realization that humanity would never surrender, no matter what they destroyed or how many they killed. High Commander Zethral had lost half his fleet to enemies who should have been crushed in the first week. His ground forces on Earth had been reduced to fortified positions that required constant reinforcement just to maintain, and every soldier sent to the surface knew they were unlikely to ever return home. The humans had taken Admiral Patricia Hayes' strategy and turned it into something the galaxy had never seen before. Human ships, many of them still held together by improvised repairs and desperate engineering, struck deep into Valori supply lines. Raiding parties hit targets that should have been safely guarded, behind enemy lines. And on Earth, the resistance had grown into something that could not be contained or controlled or even properly understood. Captain Benjamin Morton had died 6 months into the war, his ship destroyed while covering the retreat of civilian transports fleeing a Valori assault. But his tactics lived on in every human captain who followed him. The hit-and-run attacks that traded honor for effectiveness and dignity for survival. Maria Santos commanded a new vessel now, one of the first ships built with hybrid technology that combined human engineering with systems reverse-engineered from captured Valori equipment. She had watched young officers become veterans, and veterans become legends, and legends become memories honored by those who came after them. The cost of the war was written in names that filled memorial walls across what remained of human civilization. Millions of lives sacrificed for a chance at survival. The Valori was written in something harder to measure, the slow erosion of certainty that had defined their empire for 1,000 years. They had believed themselves invincible. They had believed that conquest was their birthright. They had believed that no species could resist the might of the Dominion. Humanity had proven them wrong on every count. The final negotiations took place aboard a space station that had been constructed specifically for the purpose. A neutral ground where neither side held advantage. Ambassador Kira Voss represented humanity at the table, her face bearing scars from an assassination attempt she had survived through sheer stubbornness 2 years into the war. She was 58 years old now, aged beyond her years by the weight of everything she had witnessed and everything she had done to keep her species alive. High Commander Zethral sat across from her, his scales dull with exhaustion and his forearms folded in a posture that no longer conveyed arrogance. "You have proven yourselves," he admitted, and the words clearly caused him physical pain to speak. "The Dominion withdraws its claim to your solar system." Kira shook her head slowly. "That is not enough." Zethral's eyes widened with something that might have been shock, or might have been the first stirrings of fear. "What more could you possibly want from us?" Kira leaned forward and spoke in a voice that carried the authority of a species that had refused to die. "Reparations for every life you took during this war," she said. "A formal guarantee that no Dominion vessel will enter our space without explicit permission from the Terran Coalition." She paused and let him absorb those demands before delivering the final one. "And an acknowledgement, broadcast to every species in your empire, and every corner of the galaxy you have touched, that humanity is not to be threatened." Sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been a sob. "You ask for our humiliation. I ask for our security," Kira replied without sympathy. "You came to our world believing we were innocent because we had never faced an enemy from beyond our own planet." She stood and looked down at the alien commander with eyes that had seen too much death to hold any softness. "You were wrong about us," she continued. "We have faced enemies every single day of our existence as a species. We have fought ourselves with a creativity and brutality that your Dominion cannot begin to imagine." She gestured at the stars visible through the station's viewports. "Every generation of humans has produced warriors, Commander, and those warriors never forget how to fight. Not even when the wars end. Not even when they grow old. Not even when they think they have left violence behind them." The treaty was signed 3 weeks later, after negotiations that extracted every concession Kira had demanded and several more that she added along the way. Valori forces withdrew from the solar system in a procession of defeat that was broadcast across the galaxy. The terms of humanity's victory spread through trade routes and diplomatic channels, carried by merchants and ambassadors who told the story of the species that refused to surrender. Admiral Patricia Hayes retired for the second time, moving to a small farm in Montana, where she could see the stars at night and remember everyone who had died to keep them free. Colonel Daniel Price returned to his family, though he kept his cybernetic arm calibrated and ready for combat, because old habits died hard. Maria Santos received command of a new ship, one of the first in a fleet that would protect humanity's borders for generations to come. And across Earth, veterans returned to civilian life once again. They went back to their families and their jobs and their quiet routines, hanging up uniforms that still fit and storing weapons that still worked in closets and garages where they could be reached if needed. Carl Bishop returned to his small town in Texas and reopened the repair shop he had left behind 4 years before. His wife found him in the garage one evening, not cleaning weapons this time, but simply sitting and staring at the old military communicator that had called him back to war. "It is over," she said gently. Carl looked at her with eyes that had seen things he would never be able to describe. "No," he said quietly, "it is never over. We just get breaks between the fighting." He was right, as it turned out. The galaxy was vast and filled with dangers that humanity was only beginning to understand. Other empires existed beyond the Valori dominion, some of them curious about the species that had defeated such a powerful enemy, and some of them eager to test whether humans were truly as dangerous as the stories claimed. The channels that had summoned veterans to war remained active, monitored by men and women who understood that peace was temporary and vigilance was eternal. The message could go out again at any moment, and when it did, warriors would answer, because that was what humans did. They fought, and they survived, and they kept fighting until there was nothing left to fight against. The Valori had learned that lesson at a cost of millions of lives and 4 years of grinding defeat. Any other species that threatened humanity would learn it too, sooner or later, one way or another. Ambassador Kira Voss gave one final address before retiring from public life, speaking to a crowd that had gathered on the steps of the rebuilt coalition headquarters in Geneva. "They believed we were innocent," she said, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. "They believed we were children who had never seen war and would surrender at the first sign of." She smiled, and there was no warmth in it. "They did not understand that we are the children of warriors," she continued, "born from a history of endless conflict, shaped by struggles that made us harder and stronger and more determined than any species that has known peace." She looked up at the sky, where ships patrolled and stations orbited, and the memory of 4 years of desperate warfare still hung like smoke that would never fully clear. "We are humanity," she said, "and we are never truly at peace." She paused and let those words settle over the crowd, before finishing with a statement that would be carved into monuments and taught to children for generations. "We are simply between wars." The crowd cheered, and somewhere in the darkness between stars, other species listened and learned, and decided that perhaps the humans were best left alone, at least for now, at least until they forgot the lesson that the Valori had paid so dearly to learn.